Hello, hello. For today's song of the day, we're looking at this part of Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. It's properly a 44-minute long song, and then depending on the release you have, it's split up into different parts. So just talking about one part of it might be, I don't know, maybe sacrilegious to you big Jethro Tull fans out there, but there is one particular part that I think is my favorite of the whole piece, and has really kind of unlocked the significance and beauty of the rest of the thing for me. So I think it's a good kind of not that you should go out of your way just to listen to this part. I still would recommend listening to the whole thing, but like really kind of focusing in on this part and seeing it as a way to kind of uncover the genius of the whole thing. Because I really do think this is a pretty masterpiece, amazing song, and I kind of underappreciated it for a long time. During my first kind of dad rock phase in my early teens, where I mostly just listened to classic rock and I thought modern music was stupid. I don't know how I was such a wrong generation type of pseudo boomer, but whatever. I listened to it then and I was into it, but it's like as my kind of taste developed in parallel, when I wasn't listening to a lot of classical rock music, when I came back to it just recently, when my dad was listening to it in the car, I realized that like a lot of things that I'd come to appreciate in modern music are all over the place here, and this is still a really brilliant and very far ahead of its time example of a lot of things that are now among my favorite in music. And it was interesting too because this part stuck out to me, in particular aspect of this section really blew me away when you were listening to it in the car. And then when I went back to listen to it myself later, I was looking for this part and kind of skipping around and stuff. And I was trying to kind of piece together what part of the album it was on. My dad's copy and my copy had different splits where the tracks started and ended. So it wasn't easy, but just that kind of feeling of exploring around it and hearing just kind of jarringly juxtaposed the different recurring motifs and kind of the conflicting parts and the parts that kind of weave themselves through the whole thing really gave me a good sense of the overall structure of it. And it made me realize that once I actually kind of found this part, that I think it is kind of the centerpiece of it. Some of the lyrics recur themselves again at the end, as does the kind of opening part, which of course has the title drop. Your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick. At the end, that is put right next to the closing verses of this segment. So I think it stuck out to me for good reason. And it was difficult to find too because I was looking for this one specific piano part that comes in here, and the beginning of this segment is largely an instrumental, the "You curl your toes and fun" part. And it has some things in the upper register. Of course, Jethro Tull is famous for its flautist and the flute playing. But there's a really cool xylophone part here and some piano in the higher register, and he sings really beautifully way up in his falsetto in this part too. So I thought like, oh, they couldn't have had this really wonderful, beautiful crystalline piano part in this part as well, after kind of introducing the tenor range of this track. But I think it's actually different. Like I think it's more about establishing that pitch range, that once you start introducing elements that are way up in the higher register, then you can kind of do a more bold melody in that register, and people are kind of like more anticipating it, I guess. So I think that's actually very genius in kind of songwriting, that you first kind of dazzle them in that area, and then you can do something like solid. So there's some stuff going on here. There's some really wonderful xylophone and flute and singing. There's a really cool part where it's just like in total solitary isolation, a guitar strumming, dun, 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 dun. And it feels very ahead of its time that they would focus on just like a noise like that. It almost feels like something more like music concrete or field recording or something like the books, which is like very experimental, like pulling acoustic sounds in isolation and putting them together into something that has like a very unnatural sort of structure, or something like gas, what they call positive drone, where you're putting together an ambient track that's made out of all just sort of like pleasant sounds. So that sort of thing I wouldn't have appreciated at all as in my teens, but that I've now really grown to love in a totally unrelated genre and in a totally unrelated field. Um, and then hearing it here again, it's such a wonderful example. It's pretty cool. It's pretty mind blowing in a way. But then the real amazing part starts with this piano that's like a constellation. And I use this term a lot, constellation, when I'm talking about music, or constellatory, or things like that. And this provides a good enough example, I think, to truly kind of delve into what I mean by this. And it's not that I'm consciously thinking of this imagery every time I use this word. I just think it's a really cool word, and it's very evocative of something for me. But this gives me a good chance to actually break it down and figure out like why that word especially is appealing. So it's like in a constellation you have the stars, which are there and actually visible, and then you have the invisible lines that you have to just draw with your mind, that only really makes sense from the perspective of the Earth. Like, of course, you're looking at three-dimensional stars that are in depth hundreds and thousands of light years apart from each other, but are flattened onto a sort of sphere from the Earth's vantage point. So from this like one unique perspective, you're able to see these invisible lines, such that if you pictured yourself moving from star to star, in between it's really only blackness. It's dark, it's silent. There's nothing of note or significance. But if you remember this one miraculous almost perspective, then you can perceive this invisible line. And when I hear certain music, when I hear the kind of songwriting that you get in this piano part, it just makes me think of that. It's where there's like notes that are kind of in isolation, and it's kind of up to you as the listener to work out what the actual melody is and what the connection between these notes are and what the kind of like staggered chords are that they're developing. It's not like anything is ever given to you in this regard. Not that it's difficult or anything necessarily, but you're aware that it's your perspective that's bringing it out. And I can tell this piano part is like very important in the way that it's developed. The first time it comes in, it has this kind of like organ sound accompanying it, and it almost sounds like the organ is like working to generate the piano sound, which I think is I'm only fairly certain it's a piano sound. I'm talking about the part that goes like dun 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 dun. In case you're wondering, in case that's not clear. And at the very start of it, there's this kind of like chugging organ sound that almost feels like it's trying to get it going. That producing this is so miraculous and difficult that it requires this like steeling of the will. And the way that it comes out in these verses, and then there's kind of like a break in between. Again, I think really highlights its importance and almost its like thesis-like role in defining this part thematically. So we should talk about the lyrics a little bit. I think the lyrics of this entire piece, Thick as a Brick, are pretty genius. It's kind of an anthem of the downtrodden. The titular line, of course, saying, "Your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick." Basically saying those in a position of power, those that are writing policy, those that are making rules, even if they feel like they're doing it for the betterment of those that aren't well off, the uneducated, the working class, they really cannot empathize with their struggles. They actually have no idea how it feels to be in such a powerless position, to have no agency, and to have even like not a critical understanding of the world around you. And they don't pull any punches, you know. They're saying thick as a brick. It's a pretty rude thing to say, but they're saying it empathetically. That it's like a tragedy that there are people that just do not have the opportunity to develop the critical thinking skills and the introspection and the ability to kind of like articulate complex thoughts that's required to even understand the politics and the complications of the world around them, even though it's those very things that are constantly squashing them and removing them from power and disabling any ability they have to better themselves. It's such a tragic situation, and usually we kind of take the perspective of how do we solve things from the top down? What great evils are there at the top that we need to worry about and such? Which is a good way to do it, because that's actually how you affect change, is by bullying the people at the top into doing it, rather than expecting the downtrodden class to be able to just kind of make change themselves on their own. They lack the power and means. But sometimes there's kind of an empathy that's lost in this situation, that we more and more see the disadvantaged as kind of just an entity unto themselves, and not as a group of individual people that are struggling, that are having. I mean, I did it myself just earlier in this video when I was talking about uneducated working class people and how they might have difficulty understanding the politics around them. That wasn't a reasonable thing to say. And this song, I think, does a really good job of bringing out the individual characteristics and the richness of the lives of these kind of characters that are never named. They're never really examined in kind of an exhaustive depth, but just sort of appear as archetypes. So in this section, it starts talking about, with kind of like a scathing critique of this lawyer, this young lawyer who's going into the courtroom, and they're saying that he's following the example of comic book heroes that he's read, that his justice and motivation come from these fictional idols. So then the speaker goes one further and says, all right, well, if these paragons of justice and virtue that we read about in the comics are all that, and if they're really kind of our role models in this situation, why don't they just rise up from the pages and show us all the way? And it really kind of brings out the ridiculousness of the situation by saying, like, why won't you join your local government? And of course that carries a lot of connotations of, I don't know, ineffectuality, sitting around in a room and making decisions that don't really pertain to anything and don't affect anyone. Specifically the word local. And this is an unfair characteristic, of course. Local government is vastly underestimated because people have this perception of it. But it is kind of pointing out the massive gulf between how we aestheticize and how we think of things that have revolutionary impact, like being a superhuman and flying around and punching people in the face, and then the things we feel like we're actually capable of, which is the things that will actually affect change, i.e. joining a local government, we see as very like milquetoast and boring and ineffectual and blah blah blah. We'll have Superman for president and let Robin save the day. Yeah, I don't know. It's and then there's this kind of breakdown here, and you realize, like, when you're kind of growing up, if you read these comic books and you have these power fantasies and stuff, there's a point where you realize that, like, the world doesn't really work that way, and the real power isn't in the hands of aliens that come from the planet Krypton, or billionaires that dress up like a bat and fly around and punch people. They're in the powers of billionaires that don't dress up like a bat and fly around and punch people. They're in the power of billionaires that just pay to have things done and make all the rules and stuff. And then this line, I think, is just so fantastic. Where the hell was Biggles when you needed him last Saturday? Biggles, I learned from researching this song, and by that I mean clicking on this, is this comic about a fighter pilot named Biggles. There's a series of adventure books for him, kind of like a shonen type series, I would imagine. Um, he was around for quite a while. He had like lots of adventures and such, and you can see that for people of this generation, Biggles would definitely be a very inspirational figure, virtuous, brave, heroic, capable of achieving world-changing feats, I'm sure. Um, but then, where was he? So, where was Biggles when you needed him last Saturday? And we don't know what this event was. We don't know what happened last Saturday, of course. But it's just specific enough to know that they're talking about um, like an archetypical situation that could happen in anyone's life. But like a specific instance where you're, I don't know, maybe you're at the pub. I'm stereotyping someone. Maybe you're at the pub, and you're trying to settle up your tab, and you don't really have enough money, but there's a guy being a jerk to your girlfriend, and you feel like there's something you ought to do, but nothing really, you know that there's nothing really you can do to change anything about this, and you're wondering yourself, like, what would Biggles do here? And Biggles just wouldn't exist here. This just isn't a problem that he would have in his life. So where the hell was he? Like, and where are all the sportsmen? You know? And here I think we're drifting away from comics and just talking about actual athletes. All the athletes you admire, all the football players and such. Where were they? You've counted on them in so many other cases to inspire you and to give you hope for the future, and yet I don't know, they're just not there. And I love this verse too. All the other verses have kind of a cool enjambment where these lines are shorter, but then they elongate the last syllable, and there's like kind of a little break before the next little mini stanza. But here, after it always pulled you through, there's almost no break, and it's like the cruel truth has just kind of stomped right in and broken down your reality of they're all resting down in Cornwall, writing up their memoirs for a paperback edition of the Boy Scout Manual. So they don't really care about your problems. All of these people, were they real in any sense? I mean, of course, some of them are, but they don't have the problems you have. All they're doing is writing down their memoirs to inspire the next group of children, but not actually have the follow through to actually make impactful change for the better in their lives. So a very sad lesson, I suppose. And over top, of course, is just this gorgeous, glittering, constellatory piano that I feel kind of represents the hope that we have based on these fictional idols, you know? That we string together the miraculous situations, the miraculous stories, the situations where justice overcomes evil, and those points of hope are enough for us to perceive some sort of pattern, some sort of path that we can move from star to star. But really, there's a whole lot of empty space in between. Beautiful song, beautiful part. That piano, oh my lord. Check it out. I would listen to the whole thing if I were you. But if you don't have time, check out this part and see if you can get the appeal of it. And the rest of it is just like this too. I feel like there's a feeling I get when I first started getting into like larger classical works, like symphonies and multi-movement things, where the first few times I listen to it, like only one or two parts will stand out to me. But they'll really stand out. They'll like kind of hook me immediately, just like certain little melodies or certain resolutions and stuff. But I know that eventually, with study and contemplation, that the whole song, the whole piece, will turn out to be just as genius and just as beautiful. And I love that feeling. I really enjoy when I know that I'm just on the outer edge of something that's so rich and beautiful and full. And I'm getting that here too. So I'm going to keep listening to this and studying this. It's a pretty amazing piece. Okay, that's all for now.